Hello and welcome to Digital Photography's I3 lecture series. We are thrilled to have Bastienne Schmidt as our guest speaker tonight. Bastienne grew up in Greece and Germany. She is currently based in New York, where she works as a multimedia artist. Her work is in the collections of the Museum of Modern Art, the International Center of Photography, the Victoria and Albert Museum, and the Corcoran Gallery. She has published 5 monographs to date: Vivir la Muerte, American Dreams, Shadow Home, Home Stills, and most recently, Topography of Quiet. Her first project, Vivir la Muerte, was shown in a solo exhibition at the International Center of Photography in New York. It was also awarded the Kodak Prize in Germany. She is the recipient of a Soros Foundation grant to document how Americans deal with death and dying. Her project, Shadow Home, won Best Photo Book Prize and was given a solo exhibition at the Museum für Kunst und Gewerbe. Did I say that right? In Hamburg, 2005. Her project, Home Stills, was also given a solo exhibition at the Southeast Museum of Photography, 2010, the Houston Center for Photography, and the Manesh Museum in St. Petersburg, 2012. Bastienne's career spans so many different approaches and types of media. It's fascinating to see the intersection of photography, painting, works on paper, installation, and we're really lucky to have you here tonight. So welcome to our lecture series.
Thank you so much. Hello. Okay. Hi. Thank you, Jaime, and thank you, SVA, for inviting me. It's a great honor, and we're going to have like a little look back of 25 years. It's kind of a journey for me. I mean, the thing is, it starts in Greece, my journey. I was born in Germany, but we moved to Greece when I was 9 years old. My father was an archaeologist, and that is kind of my sense of place. My father was working in an island called Samos, which is very close to Turkey. And since I was like 3 years old, that's kind of a landscape that I associate with, which is seeing just like the blue horizon line of the sky and the water and amidst an island. And I think as artists and as photographers, we collect memories. We register something in our real life, and then we assign a meaning to it. And when you work with photography, you have the great pleasure and honor to really make sense through these different collections of memories. When I was talking with Jaime before, he said, well, is memory a sense of place? I think memory is a sense of place. This is actually the museum where my father used to work. And I remember when he was working, he used to collect these pieces of Cypriot terracotta. And he had flat Greek cigarette boxes laid out on these long tables. And he would reassign pieces together. And I feel with my artwork, and especially with photography, what I do, I collect over many years for a project. Sometimes it spans 20 years. And I keep them in my mind or in real life in these little different boxes. And then I kind of pull them together. And usually it takes like, I make it into a book or so. For me, a book is like a perfect combination to really conceptualize like a bigger project, which goes for me beyond an exhibition or so, which is like a temporary pulling together. That's again in the museum. And another important element in my way of working is like the idea of a fragment. A fragment is something that's vulnerable, that's open-ended, that maybe was made and has been destroyed, but it can be reconstructed or not. Growing up in Greece also gives you this idea of geometrical shapes. Anywhere you look, you see things reduced to the minimum. I mean, especially when you go to the Cycladic Islands, the colors are very simple. It's white and blue, and the shapes are very simple too. So it has been going on in my photography for a long time that it pulls together in a few geometric shapes in terms of composition. That was in Turkey. When I bought a house in Samos 25 years ago, there have been many changes since. Most changes is in the relationships with the inhabitants of this village called Pagondas. All the people that I used to know, 90% of them have died. And in a way, I feel also photography pays due to this historic memory of a place that really cannot stay the way it was. This was the postman. And the postman was sitting in this kind of old, decrepit room with a telephone. People would come to make their telephone calls. And if you're a postman in a village, you're kind of king because you know everything that's going on in the village. When I moved to Greece in 1969, there was no TV. You would go to a village and it was a big honor. Like if the village, a square, there was one little box with a black and white TV. And on the weekends, people would gather together at the platia, the main square, open the box and sit together and watch TV. That is an island called Ikaria. These are Greek Orthodox priests on an island called Tinos, which is a holy island. This is a monastery in Patmos, which is St. John's Monastery. So some images, I like them because it's a physical thing that's happening, or I like them just because they're pure photographs. In this case, it's an overlapping of both. In a way, with my photography, I collect also kind of little notes to myself, what I want to do with my other artwork. Sometimes I create these kind of big installations or mini installations, but that I really like this idea of forming a circle with wood. It's kind of a momentary installation that will be burnt away. They used it to make coal. So after I moved to America in 1989, I pretty much came with a little suitcase and not a lot of ideas. I mean, I had a really interesting, great photography teacher who said I should come to New York. And my father actually was born in New York, although he was originally from Germany. And after he died, I really felt curious about this sense of place, what New York is and what I could do. And I had the pleasure of meeting a friend from Peru who was a performance artist. And she said, just come visit me and we work on a project together. So we photographed in different archaeological sites. And one day she invited me to the morgue in Lima in Peru. And I said, well, that's kind of odd. But of course, curiosity took over. And I went there and it was a mind-boggling experience. It was scary. It was things I'd never seen. It was gruesome. But it was also moving and touching. And my father died previously, 6 months before that. And I had to grapple with this idea, where do we place our sense of grief? I mean, when you live in a Western society, everything is neatly tucked away. You grieve in private, unless you have like very specific religious rituals. And then I saw also the difference in Germany, or in Greece and Italy, how people displayed their mementos of grief. And then that was my first encounter in Latin America, and I was really hooked in a way. So this trip was the first one of many trips. I traveled to Peru, I traveled to Guatemala, I traveled to Mexico, to Cuba, to Brazil, to Colombia. And in a way it was like, it was like a trip, like it was a voyage of Candide. Candide is this character in Voltaire's novel that just leaves very blue-eyed and naive into the world and just lets things happen to him. And in a way I felt the same way because I had no specific training. I was definitely not an anthropologist, although I learned very quickly. If you want to find out something to a place where you don't know anybody, go to the newspapers, meet some journalists, and go to the university, and they help you find other people. So this particular image was taken in Guatemala. It was for the Day of the Dead, no, actually in Mexico, in Pátzcuaro. And for the Day of the Dead, they put this kind of fishing net into the sky and put the marigolds in it. And that's actually another thing that, culturally speaking, connects a lot of cultures, this connection, visual connection between the living and the dead for the Day of the Dead. It's the pathway that really opens on this particular days to really connect the living and the dead together. And it's a beautiful visual symbolism. This is another lake, the lake of Titicaca, one of the most beautiful journeys. When I traveled there in the early 90s, there was a truck going once a week around the lake from Peru to Bolivia, back to Peru again. And again, it was not a specific journey. I mean, it's not that you can set out and say, I'm searching for death. That's kind of gruesome and macabre. But on the other end, you just are open and see what happens. And it happened that I just arrived in this very remote village, and a procession came towards me, and it turned out it was a funeral procession, and I just followed it. That's in a church in Guatemala, in Zunil. Another thing what I love about photography is these different uses of photography. There's a whole history of funeral photography. There's a whole history of these porcelain photographs in cemeteries in Italy, in Spain, in Greece, and this one was in Cuba, in Havana. Again, cemeteries seem these kind of abstract cities of the dead. That was in Guatemala. This was during the Day of the Dead, and they had like marimba bands. People are crying, people are dancing, people are laughing, people are eating, people are sleeping there. I think it's allowing the togetherness of all emotions within the safe context of family and friends. That's kind of it's just very emotional. This was taken in Colombia. Again, this was really far away from the city. I had gone initially to Bogota, met some journalists, and they set me up with some anthropologists in the Guajira, which is which is in Rioja, very close to Venezuela and south of Venezuela. And they told me of this ritual when people die. Usually they go into the desert for a couple of weeks and just spend time with the deceased and with the families and friends, and just are there. And usually in a lot of cultures, women are the official bearers of grief and mourning, which means that they allow themselves much easier to show their emotions. So the women were hiding their faces, but really hollering and crying and screaming, whereas the men usually would sit to the side in the hammocks and only rarely showed emotions, but they would walk over one by one to the women and let themselves fall down and then go away again. That was exhumation. After a funeral and iteration, after 3 years, there's a second religious ceremony at the cemetery where the whole family comes together. And it's also kind of like the second stage of grief. After 3 years, you can see that the body has gone. So it's painful, but it's also an acknowledgement that things have changed. The body has evaporated. This was in Mexico, a girl sleeping in the cemetery. It's in Peru. That's in Colombia. I mean, during this trip, I mean, in the book, if you're ever interested, there are a couple of pictures that are really gruesome. I only showed maybe one or two. I didn't want to shock you too much. And there's a big quandary when you work in an area like that. What do you show and what don't you show? And I was pretty much of that school that whatever happens, whatever is reality, you should not hide it. On the other hand, I have to say I did this as a single young woman, and I'm a mother now. So I see certain things also very differently. I mean, I photographed a dead baby. I don't think I could do that anymore. It's just... Another thing that's always appealing to me is this kind of sense of wandering. A lot of times things, you discover, explore things without any specific aim, and it's kind of like a little miracle sometimes happens if you keep yourself open to that moment. That's again the Lake of Titicaca. So that was the funeral procession that I talked about it before. And I just followed them along, and the really moving thing was whatever they did together. They followed the procession, they carried the casket, they cleaned the cemetery, they dug the grave, they brought each one pieces of cloth, they laid out coca leaves, self-brewed alcohol, yucca, potatoes, and spread it all out and had a funeral meal afterwards. That was during the funeral meal, all the blankets together. And I think it taught me, I mean, we can actually take things back if we choose to. And when my father died in Greece, we did to a certain extent, and I have to say it was one of the most incisive moments in my life. Of course, it was incredibly sad, but it was also very empowering because I come from a family of 5, and all my siblings and I, my mother, we did things together. So we kept the body with us for a day. And we did everything what we wanted to do. We washed the body, we clothed my father, we wrote letters to him, I cut my hair, we put coins in his wallet. And it's, I think, extremely helpful if you just take charge of your own feelings and do something what you see fit in that context. And I think a lot of times in our modern society, it's kind of a prescribed way of acting, and it can a lot of times feel alienating. This was photographed in a prison in Colombia, in Bogota, called El Modelo. And these were professional killers, sicarios, hiding their faces. I was photographing during lunchtime and had this kind of knee-jerk reaction to not want to be photographed. This is one of the most gruesome images. I would go with the police in Bogota, Colombia, and it was a really gruesome time. At that time, it was like the second wave of the civil war, and there were in Bogota alone, at least every night, at least 15 to 20 dead people. This was in a funeral home in the calle 33A, where in every room there was happening a different funeral. And that was the first image when I met this friend, Luciana, who introduced me to the morgue. That was a traditional photographer who would do these contact prints, very small, for passports. It's a walk-in closet. Not a walk-in. That's in Brazil, a story that I did many years ago. So the second part of the journey it's called American Dreams. It's my second book, actually. And for a while, I traveled extensively in the US. I had arrived as a pretty recent immigrant, and I think it gives you this particular vision what America is and isn't. It's very acute. Everything strikes you like as some kind of really interesting, strange ritual, because of course you compare it to wherever other places you lived in, and it's just different. There was a flag parade in New York City. Here we go. I think that is a mantra that keeps it going. That was in Arizona, some very remote place. That was a bodybuilding contest in Chicago. And Mrs. Bodybuilding contest. This was a spring break in Daytona Beach, which is also quite a sight. That's a nearsighted cowboy and Flagstaff. This was shooting camp in Cleveland, Ohio. And the strangest thing was, like, you had these very young girls. I mean, they were all part of families, and they would shoot these really powerful rifles. In the morning, you would wake up, and you just like heard this pop, 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 pop. Just like when you wake up, you don't know exactly what's happening to you, and then you realize it's people shooting all around you. That was in Huntsville, Texas, the deathbed. Actually, my husband and I, we did a project that Jaime mentioned about death and dying in America, and one of the segments was also about hospice and prisons, but also specifically about prison culture. There's a lot of things happening with death and prisons. I mean, first of all, I mean, there are certain states where life means life, which means you're gonna die in prison. And then it also means after death, you kind of lose your sense of individuality. A lot of times, if your family doesn't claim you very fast, you end up in the prison cemetery, and then you only have a number and no name. And in Huntsville, Texas, there was also a prison cemetery, and everybody that was executed had the number and an X. And the executions, they take place at midnight, for the reason being they don't want people to really be too aware of it, because in the outside it looks kind of an old-fashioned, kind of quaint, small town, but behind the wall, other things happen. That was a rodeo, a Navajo Indian rodeo. That was a visit to Disneyland. Jenny, you know this. This is in Montauk. That was the prom of the East Hampton High School before I ever moved to the Hamptons. It was like 20 years ago. So, I mean, proms are not very. I mean, a lot of people in Europe don't really know what proms are. I mean, you don't do it really. So it's. It seems from the outside kind of a throwback to the 50s or 60s, because it's something very formal. You dress up, and it's also defines in a very specific way the boy meets girl culture. But on the other hand, it looks very beautiful to photograph also. That's at West Point. Tourism Monument Valley. That was a museum made for all kind of like events happening in America. That happens to be Jackie Kennedy with her 2 children, a wax museum in Branson, Missouri. Branson, Missouri is the capital of the country songs and kitsch. That's on Venice Beach. That's in Coney Island. That's part of a ceremony where they celebrate their ancestry and looking back of the memory of the slaves that lost their lives coming over. And it happens every year in the fall. And they toss flowers and fruit into the ocean and walk out steadily backwards, praying. So my third book is called Shadow Home. Shadow Home is like a 20-year look at Germany. I mean, in my particular case, I was born in Germany, moved to Greece when I was 9, and then moved to Italy and then to the States. So in one way, I never felt particularly German, but on the other hand, it's always something that I was being identified with. And it's not so easy being a German in the sense that just it's a complicated country. It's an interesting culture. It's not my home, but I think after having worked with it through images also, I've come to peace with the cultures, the part of the cultures that I really think are interesting, the ones that I don't particularly feel close to. That's a tree. Shows the complicated roots. I mean, sometimes you wish you had these deep roots in one place and not tangled up in all these other places. On the other hand, it's also very appealing to be have a portable suitcase and you take your home and your culture with you any place you go. So I only really remember Germany from going back on these car trips with my parents, my siblings, every summer. And for me, German culture was a very closed-off culture. It was very hard to kind of get into it on a fast level. And especially as children, there's always these sign like, this is verboten, it's verboten to step in the grass or the... So I had this dilemma. On one hand, yes, it was part of my culture because my first fairy tales were probably German and I spoke the German language well, but it was also very unfamiliar because Greece was a very warm and embracing culture and late evening culture where children could do no wrong. They were part of everything. and Germany felt as a child like quite opposite. And I photographed my siblings. Some of my siblings live in Germany, so I would visit them. My sister bought a house in East Germany, and I photographed her children. And in a way, I tried to kind of reflect like certain glimpses of my own kind of childhood memories of Germany. So on the right, you see actually a dollhouse that she purchased from East Germany, from like an old East German house. And you see all these little kind of like strange kind of like cultural connotation of these walls, the pictures. That's my sister in a dirndl. Right after the wall came down, to the left, there's all these kind of signs with different doorbells. And it was in East Germany, and what was interesting, it was like such a dichotomy between West Germany and East Germany. But the nice thing about East Germany was it felt kind of less organized, less well thought out. It was kind of like looser and more open, probably also much poorer. But it changed pretty fast. I went back, a lot of times I go back to the same places just to see what happens. And especially in Berlin, there were like radical changes in the next 3-4 years. This is the mother of a friend of mine. And again, this is for me like a kind of a typical old-fashioned German image, like where you sit on the sofa and the pillow, you see it's called Paradekick. You give like a little kick to the pillow and nothing can move it. And then you have a piece of cake. On the left, you see Plattenbauten, which is a very East German way of building. They had this prefabricated kind of beton, concrete slabs, and they were very kind of ugly looking. And you had like whole cities just built with those. And that's on the right. On the left, you see the hay fields in East Germany. The beautiful thing about East Germany, it just looked relatively untouched. You had all these kind of incredible, beautiful, original structures of villages, and it was just very old-fashioned, like time had stood still. It's a picnic in Frankfurt. That was the walk in between the two walls in Berlin before the wall opened. And I was born in 1961, so I was one of these people. It's our generation. We thought the wall is never going to come down. It was just something you could not imagine. It was like, yeah, the division between South and North Korea. It's something. It was a certainty. And when it actually happened, I had moved to New York, and I met a guy, and he said, let's jump on a plane, let's witness history. He was like this very wealthy New Yorker who thought, I take my ladder, I go to the Brandenburg Gate in the wall, and we can witness history. So that's what we did. But this picture actually was shot like 10 years before that. That's in the Pergamon Museum on the right. On the left, there's it's an image of the temple to German culture called the Walhalla. It's very German. So you have these kind of marble statues of all these kind of thinkers, and the cabbage. So these were in East Germany. From the Secret Service, they would collect samples of people they didn't like and dissidents, and they would put them in these mason jars for dogs to smell during demonstrations. And then they would also keep these handwritten files and notes. It was all pre-computer. And when the wall came down very fast, they tried to shred a lot of these documents, but they didn't manage to shred all of them. So for quite a few years, you could go to this center called the Gaukbehörde and see if there was a file on you and your family. And there were cases where literally the husband was spying on the wife. That is also a pretty strange thing. It's in Rügen, in an island off the North Sea in Germany. And it used to be a vacation home for Nazis, but they had this very small cubicle rooms, and they used it as a propaganda machine to send children for a vacation to try to get votes or so. And then when it became East Germany, they made this kind of like, the East German army took it over and made this kind of strange, first it was part of the army, but then after the wall came down, they made it into this kind of museum of the history of the East German army. On the left, there is a crucifixion, like across at a pilgrimage place in Bavaria, and on the right, that's part of a concentration camp, the wall, the outside wall, in Sachsenhausen in East Germany. That's a train station. That's the castle of Ludwig II, which is like probably where most tourists go. The Swan. It's a good fellow German. It's a Nazi. That's it. So my fourth book is called Home Stills. What had happened in the meantime, I had a couple of kids with my lovely husband. We had moved out to the kind of suburbs. I mean, not really, but kind of. I had to learn how to drive, which was very traumatic after living in New York for many years. And I saw life just shifted. I saw it out of a different perspective. And I started to work on this project where sometimes I incorporated my children, but it was really about this kind of shift of identity with my work and myself, moving from the city to the country, but also where can I place myself? And I work with a tripod, and mostly they're shot with a Mamiya 6.7 and a long release time. And it's also this idea that you really can exchange being the subject and the object. So it's important for me to be on both sides, on the side of the camera and the other side. And I play also, that's my first color project. For a long time I don't know why, but kind of against color photography. I thought color made it look cheap, and black and white had more emotional depth. But then I realized, I mean, it doesn't really matter. I mean, it's just you have to define what color means to you and find your own authentic kind of color spectrum. And in my case, it was like 2 color families. I mean, I use a lot of red and orange, especially in the dress code. For example, when I'm in the landscape and I'm far away, it's just a color of signal. It really pops out. On the other hand, I'm also drawn to kind of very blue, calming color families. That's in Segaponic, very close where we live by. So a lot of times I pass by on my daily routines, driving around, and I see things or places, and it's like, that could be interesting to go back to. And then I just observe a place. And sometimes I photograph it with myself, sometimes also without anything. That was the car of a friend of mine. And this goes back, you're going to see it later. I mean, there's going to be a couple of drawings. It's like a series of large-scale drawings that I started doing with this project. And they were based on these kind of 50s and 60s advertising where they depicted this kind of perfect American family. The dad is getting out of the car, and the wife just brings the kids to the car. And in a way, it's kind of this little irony about these kind of commentaries, what a family is. So that's like a large-scale drawing. It's like 42 by 96 inches. And I work a lot with collage, so in this particular case, I incorporate myself also as a self-portrait in a tiny miniature version. I cut them out and paste them to the paper. And I also use a lot of drawing over and tracing paper. So it's kind of a mixed media project. That's another one from the series. Words do play also a role in this particular series. I take the words as an inspiration. The original word was home, and anything surrounded with the word, the notion of home. So that's why the project is called Home Stills. In a way, it's like it's in the home, but it's also very still, or it could be like a still life. But I play with the words home, homeless, homegirls, homeboy. So it's a homeland security. I mean, it's very interesting what context the word home is being used. That's another one of the series, and here again I use sometimes I use magazines from the 50s and 60s, and I re-photograph the images and I cut them out. And I like also the idea of repetition of a pattern. So sometimes I make my own patterns with thumbprints, or I kind of create my own brushes and repeat a certain pattern. The idea of the pattern is appealing to me as a kind of homemade concept, so I'm not really interested in making something look perfect, but the idea of the pattern is like you repeat something but it looks different, so your eye has to keep moving from one to the other. That's called the Circle of Life, and it's a big piece, 42 by 90 inches, and I work with painted paper and these kind of cut-out female figurines that most part I think of it myself. I'm working on another book project. It's called Topography of Women, and it's just a series of 60 22 by 30 kind of silhouette cuts with painted paper, which show you all these different possible types of women. So some of these women are based on kind of popular culture experiences, like you see, like the Wizard of Oz, or one could be like a woman model by Matisse or so, but otherwise I just like draw my own kind of fantasy. That refers, this image refers to piece of land art by Smithson, and it's the spiral jetty. It's a very famous piece of land art, but it's made of stone. It's in Utah, and I decided to recreate it in a soft material. And the idea or the twist is it's something that we all know very well, doing the laundry, and it's also a spiral in the sense that it repeats itself every day, pretty much. And but also to create this kind of relationship with the child running and me looking the other way. And a lot of times I use also my own home as a stage or as a prop set. And sometimes I ask my husband to be my assistant, or my children, or a babysitter, a real assistant. So I'm kind of pretty open-minded how it all happens. That's also, it's called the silhouette of the house. As I like the idea of silhouettes, I just decided to do the same thing with the house. And I used as illumination our car. That's called the swearing in of a citizen. Just a few years ago I became finally an American citizen. And I tried to take photographs inside the building, but I was not allowed to. So I had brought all my props with me. Then I decided I just looked to the ground, and that was my Americanness. My son Julian, he collaborated on a few pictures. So he's now 13, but we started the project when he was 2. So in the beginning, he did not really have a choice, because I would kind of wrap him up in the car seat and go to Patchogue or so. But later on, he actually had some pretty good ideas himself. So once in a while, he lets me photograph him, not a lot anymore. But that was an idea we had together. It's called the money counter. He liked to pile up these kind of lines of money. And for me, it's also this reference to this kind of Dutch genre painting, where every detail has like a very specific meaning. This photograph is shot in our house in Greece. Going to Greece, it's for me, it's still a very old-fashioned place, especially on the islands. And in this particular house, I've been photographing there for 25 years. And each year I have like a different room that's kind of my set, my prop. And one year I had decided to protect the photographs, because there are all photographs behind it, from the dust while I was gone. And then when I came back the next year, I thought, I really like this. This is kind of like the images that are muted, that cannot speak. And I decided to incorporate it into the photograph. This again was in Bridgehampton. And I think what the magic thing is about living out there is really the light, that it changes so much from very early morning. And there's a certain kind of clarity. And I took this picture right after I was pregnant. So for me, it was also about this kind of very simple shift from being an individual to shifting into motherhood. That's like the laundry. No, that's a vacuum pipe. For me, it's like the commentary of Adam and Eve being chased out of the paradise, and you're left with a vacuum. And so this. But then on the other hand, we are also surrounded by art, so it's like this going back and forth between these two different worlds. That's called Julian and the Lego. And again, when I became a mother, I did one art installation when I was living in Staten Island. There's a museum called Snug Harbor. And I saw this really tall dress you could walk into. And I wrote an imaginary diary of a housewife. Because somehow I was really obsessed with this idea. Once I was a mother, I could not do anything else or so. Because I think it's a very complex thing. Like I was used to travel around the world, and you cannot imagine how it would feel to be really kind of like tied up, not being able to leave the house. I mean, it all came out differently. That's what the reality is. Anything you pre-imagine is not true. That is an abandoned shopping mall in Patchogue with my son Julian. That's in a laundry and dry cleaner. So part of this project was also to kind of go into these kind of places where they don't really expect artists and explain the concept and ask them to be part of a project. So a lot of times they look at you like, you're kind of crazy. But it's also fun. I mean, it's for them also. It's kind of like going out of the comfort zone on both sides. That's a laundromat. That's called No Strings Attached. And this was actually an art piece created by the Hagon School students. And I buy also these kind of 50s house coats or so, whatever I think might be necessary for a photograph. That's a pretty telling image about the dichotomy living out there, which is there are a lot of workers basically doing the nitty-gritty stuff of wealthy people living out there. And right in front of our house, there was for a long time a tree farm. And that's Louis, a friend of ours, we know him very well, who was working there. That's in Florida. That's in Key West. That's the winter we're trying to get rid of. So that's my latest project and book called Topography of Quiet. And here, for the first time, I use as much drawings and paintings as I use photography, which was a big step for me because in the eyes of many, I was a photographer. And still, it's funny how people introduce oneself and me. And for some people, I'm still a photographer. For some people, I'm an artist. So I'm kind of fighting myself out of this box. But for me, Topography of Quiet meant, first of all, it meant you can be from more than one place, and you can be more than one thing. So being from more than one place means you make up your own maps, like not in terms of geography, but more in terms of what feels good for you, in terms of cultural experiences, what resonates with you. And in terms of media also, like you are free to combine. You can use collage, photography, painting, drawing. It's not, the perception of others is purely a perception, but it's the intent. So the photographs were taken in all different places. The first one was the Golden Lake in Greece from an airplane. I always loved taking pictures out of airplanes. What fascinates me is the scale of reference. And to change, to photograph things up really close and then really far away. Because if you see them even next to each other, sometimes you're really thrown off. You don't know exactly what is what. So this is in the desert in Egypt, but it could be also a dirt pile. This is a housing development right outside Cairo. This is on the Nile. Strings. That goes into my next project that I'm obsessed with. It's a project called Strings, and I'm always like this idea how we use particular objects to divide spaces, and string is like a very good way. It's kind of, you create borders or you assign kind of meaning to particular spaces. So again, this new project will incorporate drawings and paintings and photography. These are incense calls in Vietnam. And it reminds me of the first photograph in Guatemala with in Mexico with the flowers in the sky. That's in Gizi, the pyramids in Cairo. That's the floating gardens in Burma. They have like these bamboo stakes in a lake. And it's quite wonderful. Again, it's about this idea of definition and dividing spaces, a floating space. That's in Patagonia, an ice landscape. That's in Burma and in Bridgehampton. So when I work on a project, what I do in the meantime, I collect the images, but I also start working on these book dummies, and sometimes they take me years. But that's the funnest part of it, which is you can play. You really can lay it out, see what works with what. And sometimes this association can be very poetic or it can be analytical. And I worked 20 years ago with the photographer Ralph Gibson, and my job was actually to print for his book dummies. That was all pre-computer. So I would print these little C prints. I basically printed all these prints, and then he would do these book dummies. And he had like 3, 4 of the same book dummy. And he would just shift them all around and had this incredible Zen approach to really try things out. And it really taught me a lot. Another photographer that I worked for a brief time, who was incredibly inspiring in terms of the book work, is Gilles Perez, especially Telex Iran or so. And I find it quite curious. I mean, I know a lot of photographers and a lot of well-known photographers. There's some photographers who think the individual image is the prize or so, and there are other photographers who really conceptualize from the beginning and say they have to really wrap up the whole thing in the book. And the book, a designer cannot really do with the book. A designer can decide what the font is maybe or help along the lines. But the real work is like in the sequencing and really pulling it all together that it feels right. Again, it's like the hose becomes the strings or the plastic top. It's a driver in Bridgehampton and a temple in Egypt. On the left is a fertility temple in Luxor, and it was like the idea of the traces that have been left for thousands of years, really. It was a limestone temple. So all the women that went to this temple to pray for fertility would touch it, and so it was like this collective imprint. And on the right, you have like in Florida, a building site, and this kind of very ephemeral touch that goes away. These are some of the large-scale drawings. In part, I'm also influenced by Asian arts. My husband is half Chinese, and I love Japanese and Chinese arts. And I love the format of the scroll drawing because it's a very different narrative that doesn't have necessarily a center, but your eye can glide to different spots. And also Hiroshige and Hokusai in terms of the kind of color schematics. I find it's a very interesting perspective and definition of space. It's not a real space, it's an imaginary space. And in terms of techniques, I also work with very thin tracing paper that I sometimes make body imprints on, or thumbprints, or imprint strings on. And sometimes I obsessively create these kind of elements that I know I'm going to use in a different context. In this particular case, I took a photograph, which are these little connectors from an overpass of a highway in LA, and I colored them in, and I used them as these connectors of these being of strings or highways. Another material that I love working with is coffee, espresso coffee. My obsession with stain started again in the domestic arena, because you just realized, hey, a stain doesn't go away. Good stain, I can use it in my artwork. It means it's gonna keep. And the stain, I mean, there's a whole series of Ed Ruscha, and the stains is incredibly poetic, I find. It's, again, a trace what's left behind. And you also have this moment of control and not control. So you have to give in at a certain point. You can have a preconceived idea what you want to do, but then you don't know exactly what the outcome is. And I'm interested in these processes where it's open-ended, there is a moment of control and not control. And another element that I play with is these architectural models or footprints of Greek temples. Or I use the overpass of this highway in this case like a Japanese kind of sign language. And this series of imaginary mountains created also with coffee and acrylic paint and drips and chopsticks. That's again coffee and drip print. That's in Japan. And what I found interesting is, again, one hand it's nature that interferes and leaves these natural traces. On the other hand, it's the royal garden in Kyoto. There's very deliberate traces that are man-made. And that's in Greece, the night light and the fading light. And that was it. Thank you so much for coming and listening.
So my question is, when I see your early work, so I feel like your enthusiasm in your photography. I mean, you close to people, and you looking for something. You talk about your identify, be a photographer, and then you spoke to your change to color, and I feel like you far away to the people, and you start to observe them. So my question is, what kind of art, what artists affect your work?
The first part of the question is like in my first body of work, I was close to people. And the second body of work with the home stills that I shot in color, I was more far away and more observing. I think there are two things that happened. I mean, originally when I started working, I had as influences most definitely people like Robert Frank and Diane Arbus, which was like, they pull your gut. So you have this emotional need to be really close to the action. But it's also very complicated, it's also very painful because a lot of times you're also an intruder as a photographer. So you have to continually kind of find this way of where to fit in this equation or so. But because you see work that's really over an arc of 25 years, my own work has changed in terms of what my influences are. With the color work, it's definitely much more conceptual, so it's really not so much about describing an emotional content. It's more like you're envisioning a kind of a scenario, and you're trying to make a point to a specific scenario. So it is true, and the project itself was not like to describe my emotional closeness to my children. It was not really about that. It was more like this shift of identity that you experience as a person when you're first an artist and then you suddenly become a mother, and how you express it. So my later inspirations, I wouldn't even say, I love Cindy Sherman's work, the very early black and white film stills, one of my favorite bodies of work. But it's not necessarily the real influence, because in hers it was a question of identity, but not really the shift of identity from artist to mother. So I think now interesting enough, my inspirations come much more from the visual arts in a broader sense. So my inspirations come really from Sigmar Polke, Anselm Kiefer. It's more like I love art that has definitely a conceptual bent to it, but also has kind of like some kind of emotional warmth somewhere. So I think I'm like a hybrid of like my German culture and my Greek culture. So.
When I was listening to you, I was sort of wondering about the chicken or egg question. And did you take pictures to make a book, or did you make a book out of the pictures that you've taken, maybe even subconsciously?
You know what? Just a couple of days ago, I for some other reason, because I'm doing some writing, I went back to composition books that I did when I was in 1st to 4th grade. And the interesting thing is, nothing has changed. I did not realize that. I was already making books, and they were very delicately always, there was always writing in there was always a lot of drawing and photographs, collage elements. And so I think in a certain way, something is within yourself to do that. So I definitely had that always within me. And I always knew I wanted to do books. So when I set out to do a project, I know I want to do a book. On the other hand, I know it's very hard to make a book. I mean, the first one is probably the hardest, but actually today it's pretty hard too, because there are a gazillion photographers out there and everybody wants to make a book, and the whole book business has changed. It used to be that people paid you kind of nice money for a book. Now it's kind of, you're lucky if you find a publisher. So for me, the book form is incredibly important and always will be, but it's a way to conceptualize the project, and that's also a way to wrap up the project. I mean, once I worked for 5 years in a book, that's probably the length of the project or so for me.
Hi, so you talk about you using mixed media, installation, the drawings and so on, and then also you have the bookmaking side of it and your photography. With having so many different sort of practices, how does this relate to your studio practice, and how do you define yourself individually? Like, do you define yourself as a photographer in one way, as an installation artist, conceptual artist in one way, and as a drawer, painter, a mixed media artist in one way, or is it like one grand manifesto or some grand like artist statement that you group this together? And how does it relate to studio practice?
I mean, studio practice, I mean, there's some practical things that when it's in the winter, I have the tendency to really hibernate and work intensively in the studio, which means much more drawing and painting. But then again, I'm working on a project right now in the snow, so it goes into the snow and then it goes back on the paper, because I work with similar ideas. It's just the medium that express it with is different. I think it's really open-ended. For me, it's like somebody saying, are you Greek or Italian or American, or do you speak, why only speak one language? As you feel you can speak it well, why not speak them both well? And for myself, I see sometimes doing a purely photographic book, and other times to do something that's mixed media, and other times maybe it's just like a painting catalog. So I just feel it's possible to do that.
So I've spoken to a lot of people who do speak multiple languages, and they do state that, they're almost different characters in each language. And would you say that as well with your practice, with all of your, would you say that you have a different language in each of your practices?
Actually, I do agree. There's something in terms of language I can agree with. I'm not sure if it's exactly, you can translate the metaphor, but I know when I write in English, there's something else, something different comes out. And it's, on one hand, it's a big advantage because it frees you. Like if it's not the original language, it's something very freeing. You can say things you never dare to say. But on the other hand, it's also like, I'm never perfect. Probably my first language is my native language, which is German. But on the other hand, it can be also a stifling language. But it's different with painting and photography. So it's different because it's not, I grew up with both languages. Also, I have to say, I think it's a translation of a kind of nerve cell that you see something, you think something, but in reality, it's your brain, So it's, your eye is not just an eye. It's basically your brain saying, this is why I think this is interesting, needs to be documented. And I think photography takes on many different kind of languages in itself. I mean, sometimes I take a photograph just to purely document something, and I know I'm not going to use it in my art project, but it's kind of like a visual memo or so. And other times I know this is specifically related to this drawing or so. So I think it's a hybrid, and what I really find is fascinating is like the dialogue in between the mediums, because they cross and form each other.
Hi. I'm sorry, I don't know if Typography of Quiet is already a book. Is it already a book?
It's already a book.
It's already
yeah.
a book. Okay. So are you mixing in that book? Are you all showing your drawings as well as?
Actually, I have a copy. If you want to take a peek later, you're welcome to.
I'm curious if your previous books were more straight
definitely.
photography. So did you feel like there was a shift in your publishers, or like how was that received for you?
I mean, I definitely feel like I had to push a little bit further, also in terms of the publisher or the public in general to be cognizant of the fact that I had really changed, not in a short period of time, because really the drawings and paintings I had been doing for the last 10 years. But I think there's definitely a shift, but also in the perception of people. It takes them a long time to... The interesting thing is, if you start as a visual artist, it's very easy to do whatever. There's never that question asked. So, which really means that photography is stuck in this little box, and they don't like people to break out of the box. But the boxes are open anyway. Go around to all the galleries. Go to even Yancy Richardson, Yossi Milo. You're going to see, I mean, what goes now is kind of like showing photography as a medium that's very open to other mediums.
I was quite fascinated to see that shift in your work from the early photography, the black and white work, to the coffee stain drawing. So I was wondering, how much was your personal life involved in each and every stage?
I think I'm one of these people, I draw heavily for my personal life, but that doesn't mean that it's purely autobiographical kind of work or so. It's more, I think you make observations in your real life, and your real life sometimes can be big or small life. So for me, initially it was like the life was formed through these observations through travels, which is like a very open-minded world or so. And then my world shrank. So, but I felt like looking at the world up close is as fascinating as the big world, because they're very similar governing principles and many things.
I had a question for you as well, about the home stills and how you conceptualize that female figure. She's always walking away from something, and she lives in domestic spaces, but she also moves freely in larger outside spaces. And so, is that figure an extension of yourself? Is she a fictional character? And what is she walking away from?
Well, I think it's both. I mean, one of the mental references that I make is Wim Wenders in Paris, Texas. So there's usually in movies, it's like the male character that steps out of the picture. Sometimes they leave the family behind, sometimes it's a cowboy that rides out of the picture. So it was also like this twist, like the female version. You can step out of the picture, you can come back also, but you have the freedom or the right to step out of the picture, even if it's like to go for an hour walk or so. And I think it's very important to kind of get that distance from that house or home and to go into the outside world and then come back, or to see it from both sides, to change the perspective.
Hey, I found the image you took of the death penalty chair to be really shocking. I was wondering if you had any other photo inspiration that you drew from, as far as other artists, or a description of the town, even just the 30-second description you gave, where it's kind of they're hiding something bad that's happening there.
I mean, first of all, I'm sure that I'm definitely also influenced from coming originally from Europe, where there is no death penalty. So in a way, it comes as an incredible shock that a very advanced nation chooses to use that as a punishment. And then documenting that there's this dissonance of it's there, but we like to hide it a little bit. You could feel that in more than one place. And in terms of that specific picture, I mean, it's a black and white image, so it's definitely burned in on the edges, and that makes it even more stand out or poignant. But it really reminded me of this mixture between a crucifix and an ironing board, because it's padded, you get strapped in, the straps are really strong, and it's kind of like on a crucifix, really.
Thank you so much, Bastienne, for an amazing lecture.
Thank you so much for coming.